My husband and I have been members of this bird photography group for about 3 years. So a year before the pandemic, and then through all the Zoom sessions over the past 2 years. And I've seen lots of great photographs and heard lots of really interesting information. So I'm really pleased to be here tonight. In my presentation, what I'm going to do is focus on endangered birds that I've had the opportunity, the privilege to photograph in the wild. And I've taken a number of trips in the United States, but also to other countries, Bolivia, Costa Rica, you'll see as I go through my presentation. And so I've had an opportunity to photograph some very rare and very special birds. And I'm looking forward to sharing that with you tonight. And I also want to share some information about their conservation status and what we know about trying to preserve these amazing animals. So I wanted, as Steve mentioned, I've been a photographer off and on through my life, but I didn't really get into any kind of wildlife photography until I got a DSLR in 2018. And at that point, I rapidly became a very enthusiastic amateur wildlife photographer. Since that time, as I said, I've been doing some wonderful travels with my husband. And it happens that I was retiring, and this freed up a lot of time for me to make these trips. Prior to retirement, I was working in public health and social services. And now I am finding that my time is shifting, and I'm becoming very involved with conservation organizations, particularly on the local level in some of the Latin America and South America. And I'll mention some of that work later on in my presentation. So let me continue. Okay, first I want to just give you a little background on my photography equipment. I am not a gearhead. I'm not into all that stuff. My husband was very kindly offered that if you have questions about equipment, you can write to him. I'll give you his email at the end of the presentation, but that's not my strength. But I do want to tell you quickly the kind of progression I've made. I've always been a Nikon shooter, started with the 5600, went to the D500 and then the D850, which is what I use now. And I use a mix of lenses. I like using zoom lenses because I like the opportunity to kind of compose in camera. I've been very lucky to have some excellent instructors and mentors over the last number of years. So Jess Finley, Matthew Studebaker, Steve Perry. Many of you will recognize those names. Hopefully some of you had the privilege, the opportunity to travel with them and learn from them also. And despite all their strong recommendations and teaching about using tripods, I prefer hand holding over using a tripod whenever I can, because it lets me get into all kinds of other awkward positions and see things in different ways. Sometimes that's a good thing, sometimes it's not so good, but that's my preference. I consider myself an advanced beginner in post-processing, Lightroom, Photoshop, and Topaz. I have not presented any information on these photos about camera settings or anything like that, but I do give you my email address at the end. So if you have any specific questions about a particular, what am I trying to say? Photo, and you want to know settings or anything else, I'm happy to do that. All right, now just give me a second here, and let me see where I did this. I have something I want to pull up, so give me just a second. Here we go. I'll be right. I wanted to mention that, clearly I'm an amateur photographer. I'm learning all the time. But one of the things that I also am learning all the time is about birds and conservation. And I love coming back from trips and sitting down and learning more about the birds I've seen. My go-to source is Cornell Lab of Ornithology of Birds of the World. And I highly recommend that website. If you haven't explored that, I highly recommend that. Sometimes when their data is limited, which happens often in this world of conservation, I do also refer to other sites that may have data from the field. Unfortunately, a lot of our knowledge about endangered birds is woefully inadequate. If you have additional information you can share with me in the chat at the end, I would welcome learning more as we go along, so we can learn from each other. Okay, in tonight's talk, I'm going to be referring to some levels that are used to describe how endangered a species is, and they're established by the Iucn, and you may have heard that term, the red list, and those are birds and animals, plant life that are endangered. The Iucn has been around for a long time now, more than 70 years, and it's a membership organization of governments, NGOs, indigenous groups, includes over 10,000 scientists. So it's meant to be a data-driven organization. They do research, they discuss environmental regulations, and develop practice standards. The red list was designed as a way to prioritize which plants and animal species were most in need of attention. And they have a scale that goes from least to most endangered. All right. So the red list, in order to create this, they use information on changes in population size, current and historic ranges, population fragmentation, and the quality and availability of habitat. And the list goes from, for those animals that are not extinct, it goes from critically endangered up to least concern. And in the talk tonight, I will be focusing on the ones you see circled in the pink. And I have also included near threatened. That means that they are in imminent danger, particularly from threats that are human generated. So you'll see as I go forward that I've organized the talk in terms of countries. And that's just my way of organizing the information. And I'm going to start by talking about my very first trip, my very first photography and bird photography trip, which we made to Brazil. And for that trip, we had two target species that we wanted to see. One was the Lesser Macaw, and you can see the arrow there pointing to the northeast segment of Bolivia, and the other was the Hyacinth Macaw in the Pantanal. All right. The Lears or indigo macaws roost and nest in sandstone cliffs in the Canudos and other valley and other and other valleys in a unique desert biome. During the days, the macaws travel long distances looking for food. They have a preferred food, a very specific preferred food, a liqueur palm. And ideally, it makes up about 95% of their diet. But unfortunately, during drought seasons, farmers cut the liqueur palm to feed that to their cattle. And when they do that, that means that the macaws have very little to eat. And because they're still looking for food, they have begun raiding farms. This is my first pictures of birds in flight and trying to get that. And if you look very carefully on the picture on the right, you have to look really carefully because it's a distant picture. You'll see these macaws up in the tree, and some of them are holding ears of corn that they have taken right from the field. The local population of this part of Brazil lives in extreme poverty, and there are very few drinkable water sources, and harvesting is difficult no matter what, because the rainfall is so irregular. So the arrival of a flock of macaws, which can decimate a field of corn in a matter of hours, is just very problematic. And it causes a lot of conflict between the farmers and the macaws. So in response, the farmers had been shooting the macaws, killing them to prevent this devastation in their crops. And one of the responses that has been undertaken to try to resolve that is a corn subsidy program, so that farmers can apply, and if their crops are ruined by the macaws, they can get corn replaced by this program. So that's an attempt to keep the farmers from shooting the macaws. I want to just mention a bit about how endangered this bird was. The wild population of these macaws was not actually found until 1978, and it was thought even then it wasn't a very abundant species. In 1994, it was estimated there were less than 200 of these birds living in the wild. So it was listed as a critically endangered species. And since then, some of the conservation efforts have been successful, and they do think that over the past 25 years, with some protections and some of this corn subsidy program and better awareness of the threats, that the population has gradually increased and is now estimated to be about 1,200 birds total. Okay. The next wonderful macaw that we saw in Brazil was the Hyacinth Macaw. It is another magnificent bird, weighing in at 3.5 pounds. So it's the largest parrot, and it's significantly bigger than its blue relative to the east. These macaws are also dependent on palm fruit for food, and so their distribution is limited to where they can get access to these palm trees. This species faced a different type of threat, though. It was reduced to an estimated 3,000 birds by massive illegal trade between 1970 and 1990, with possibly as many as 10,000 of these birds being taken from the wild in the 1980s alone. In 1987, the species was placed on the list of endangered birds, but in fact, this worked against it. It only stimulated greater demand in the pet trade. In the 1990s, several long-term studies started, and then other ecotourism and other efforts, environmental education, nest box deployment, and they have been able to halt most of that while the pet trade. However, local trapping for feathers and food still happens, and nest sites are still destroyed for farming or to obtain eggs and chicks. It was listed as endangered, but it was downlisted, which means its status has improved to vulnerable in 2014 because it wasn't disappearing as fast as they feared. However, the latest population count, the latest reliable population count was 20 years ago. And at that time, the population was about 6,500 individuals. And we have no more current data than that. So this is a good example of a need for learning more about what's actually happening and whether conservation efforts are having a positive impact. One of the cool things about seeing endangered birds is that sometimes you see other animals along the way. And this is a jaguar that I was able to photograph right on the river, right near where we were seeing the Hyacinth Macaws. So that's a cool thing to find along the way. Okay. Our trip, and when I say multiple times I'll say that, it's my husband, Cory, and myself, was taken in March of 2020, right before the world closed down because of the pandemic. Colombia is proud of having 2,000 different species of birds. And in our 10-day trip, we saw about 200 of them. We traveled from Medellin to Cali, where we were in the mid-elevations and highlands. This particular picture, it depicts the Paramos in the central Andean highlands of Colombia. And this is the home of the endangered Buffy helmet crust. The Buffy helmet crest is a very special hummingbird. It is adapted for living at very high elevation. It also has a very restricted population, and it's known only in that area, the Paramos, around Los Nevados, I apologize for my pronunciation, around an active volcano. It's about 250 square miles. That's their entire range. There are similar, all similar habitat areas outside the park have been seriously degraded, so there's no opportunity for this bird to expand its range. It's estimated there are about 900 adults left of this bird, of this amazing hummingbird. He's real feisty. He's very cool. We saw many, many tanagers in our trip to Colombia. It's a great place for tanager photography. One of the really special ones to see was a multicolored tanager, which is endemic in the West Andes and North Central Andes of Colombia. It likes to live in humid, mossy forest at elevations between 4,000 and 7,200 feet. The species was formerly very common, but it has declined and is now seen only very infrequently and very locally. So we felt very lucky to see it and photograph it. The key problem for this bird is one that you'll hear over and over again. Significant deforestation has led to a fragmentation in the areas where this bird can live. And it has, it's losing its habitat. In Colombia, their development is very strong. They're opening up roads. They're opening areas to more logging, mining, agriculture, all kinds of things. And the species is now listed as near threatened with decreasing numbers. Here's another bird that I didn't expect to see. It's also endemic to Colombia. It's called the guacaguan, and it is an endangered bird because it also has a declining population, and it lives in a very small type of forest, a primary forest, and the logging in Colombia has severely destroyed its habitat. Another interesting piece is that the locals hunt it for food, and that's contributed to its decline. In Colombia, in Cali, they're trying to do some captive breeding programs and reintroducing the birds, but it's too soon to tell whether that will have an impact or not on the population. It's estimated there's somewhere between 1,000 and 2,500 of these left. A bird we didn't anticipate seeing, but we're thrilled to see, is the yellow-eared parrot. It's a fairly large parrot, but it is extremely rare. And it was, it's primarily in Colombia with some small fragmented populations in northern Ecuador. The birds wander around and travel, so it's sometimes hard to even spot them. The reason for the threat to this bird was that Colombia, this bird is dependent on a particular tree, a palm tree. Again, you'll hear that theme again and again, where a bird is dependent on a particular type of food or tree. And in this case, it was Colombia's national tree, the wax palm. And it's a very slow growing, long-lived species. But the wax palm has been logged for pastures and fence posts and other things, and over harvested also because they use it for religious celebrations. So the wax palm, which is the national tree, is also endangered. It's very hard to regenerate the palm trees, and this has meant that the birds have limited areas for nesting and eating. If this bird in the 1990s, they were able to find 2 flocks, each one was about 20 birds. So 40 birds left total in the wild. So in 1999, they undertook intensive conservation programs to create, they worked with local communities to safeguard what was the tiny population that was left. And from that small population in 1999, it increased to about 2,000, to 1,000 in 2009. And now they feel that there are about 3,800 individuals in Colombia, and that the flock seems to be doing very well. They have developed some protected areas, and the birds seem to be flourishing in those areas. And they were great fun to watch as they were eating. Colombia, as I said, has lots of amazing birds. And in addition to those endangered birds, I also had the chance to photograph a common patoo parent and a chick taking their cryptic stance on top of a stump, and Andean cock of the rock going in full display in the lek. So those were some other treats that we saw along the way. Okay, so we went to Tanzania last November. The primary targets of our trip to Tanzania were mammals, particularly the big cats. But while looking for mammals, we spotted a number of African birds. It wasn't always easy to convince our travel companions to stop for bird pictures when there were so many incredible mammals to see, such as this cheetah cub running to catch up with its mother. But we did get some great pictures, and I'll show you these. For our photography in Tanzania, we traveled by safari vehicle, hand holding our cameras. Because of the configuration of the windows and that opening at the top, it wasn't always possible to get the best angles for our shots. We were never allowed to leave never is a little exaggeration. You can see we left the vehicle here, but for just a moment, and we were always told to keep very, very close to the vehicles when they stopped, because the lions were extraordinarily skilled at hiding in the grass. And it wasn't uncommon for us to discover that there were lions within 25 feet of the vehicles as we were exploring the area. All of our days were hot and very dusty, and we needed to keep the cameras well covered when we weren't taking pictures. The dust was a common issue all the time, and heat distortion. Sometimes the animals were up very close. These were pictures taken on my cell phone, so that gives you a sense of how close we could get to the mammals. As you can imagine, though, as your bird photographers, our avian targets were generally much harder to see and approach, but it was awfully fun to get so close to these amazing animals. In the Ngorongoro crater, we saw herds of zebras and wildebeest, as well as hippos and elephants. And if you look carefully through there, you can see most of those animals. And in addition to these iconic animals, we saw 5 endangered birds when we were in the crater. The first of these was the gray-crowned crane, which is just an incredibly elegant bird. These birds are non-migratory, but they do move seasonally through Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, and they eat grasses and seeds and insects and invertebrates. Gray-crowned cranes share their parental duties. Both the male and the female help build a nest, incubate the eggs, and care for the young. They are considered endangered with a population of less than 20,000. For them, the threats are the loss of wetlands and the degradation of the wetlands, human disturbance, and egg collection for commercial trade. They are also endangered because of unintentional or intentional poisoning and collisions with power lines. So the efforts there, primarily in Tanzania, have been to improve and enforce policies that govern the trade of the cranes and strengthening the consequences of illegal trade. They're also looking for more ways to reduce the conflict between farmers and gray-crowned cranes in agricultural landscapes, like the indigo macaws that come in and decimate the crops, the corn crops. These gray-crowned cranes can come in and do a significant amount of damage in an agricultural area. So they're trying to look for solutions to that. On the African savannas, the secretary birds are terrestrial raptors that walk with like long-tailed eagles on stilts, and they hunt on foot. They hunt for everything from large insects to hares, but they particularly like snakes. They use well-aimed kicks and stamp to kill or stun their prey. Thick scales on their legs likely protect them from the venomous snakes. All right, these birds are about 4 feet tall, so they're quite substantial in size. They're monogamous and both parents care for the chicks. While they spend most of their time on the ground, they build their nests up in acacia trees. The biggest threats to these birds are the burning of the habitat. And we saw a substantial amount of land burned in the Serengeti, and not so much in the Ngorongoro, but in the Serengeti. And when the land gets burned in that way, there's nowhere for these birds to hide as they hunt. And so it makes it very difficult for them to find adequate food. This is the Cory Buster. And this was a bird that I learned a lot about this bird coming home. It was intriguing to look at there in Africa, but when I came home, I learned some other cool facts. It weighs up to about 40 pounds, so it is the heaviest animal capable of flight. The male Cory Buster stands between 2 and 4 feet tall and has a wingspan of 7 to 9 feet. And although they can fly, they spend about 3/4 of their time on the ground, flying only when they're threatened. A breeding season is mid-March through August, and during this time, the males form a lek to perform for the females. The males inflate their esophagus and appear to have a massive neck. Then they all display and make a low booming sound while the ladies, the females, get to window shop and select a mate. These birds don't form pair bonds, and the females are solely responsible for egg incubation and chick rearing. When the chicks hatch, they're fully feathered and able to walk. I'm sorry we didn't get to see the males performing in the lek, but nevertheless, the birds were very impressive to see. A symbiotic relationship has been observed between Cory Busters and the carmine bee eaters. The bee eaters are known to ride on the backs of the foraging Cory Bustard and eat the insects stirred up as the Cory walks. In return, the Cory may receive some form of predator detection service from the bee eaters. So why is this bird threatened? One is that the areas where they live, the habitat is becoming fragmented. So it's harder for them to find food and to have their territories. And they have a very slow reproduction rate. Another threat are those high voltage power lines that pose a danger to them when they fly. And then finally, they're threatened by 2 types of hunting. One is local subsistence hunting for food. And here's one that really bothered me because I like to do fly fishing. These birds are hunted to provide feathers for the American fly fishing trade. So for those of us out there who are fly fishermen, let's be aware that sometimes that comes at the cost of endangered birds. Okay, the Tawny Eagle. The Tawny Eagle likes open habitat, dry, such as desert, steppes, and grasslands. It lives on a very wide distribution from Africa all the way to India, and where it can find these open areas. It's a generalist carnivore and a formidable hunter, but they are also opportunistic scavengers, and they will steal prey from other raptors. And there, if you look at this picture to the lower left, you can see that there's a bone there, and this is something that this eagle has stolen from another hunter. They often hang out with vultures and are like them, ripping up at the carcasses. Unfortunately, these scavenging habits of the Tawny Eagle make it susceptible to poisoning, and it's led to their decline in many farming areas. In 2018, so 4 years ago, the Tawny Eagle was listed as least concern. That's the top of the list there on the Iucn categories. But because of rapidly decreasing numbers, the eagle is now listed as vulnerable. but once again, accurate bird counts aren't really available. The Lesser Flamingo. This is the smallest of all the flamingos, and the bulk of the population lives in the Rift Valley of East Africa. Extensive, they can move extensively from one saline lake to another. They will move in a flock, and they'll stay in that area until the food is depleted and then move on to a particular, onto another lake. So there's a lot of seasonal migration that can include movement of up to several hundred kilometers. It is a highly specialized feeder, and it's almost entirely dependent on microscopic blue-green algae. And so it has to have that in order to survive. Breeding is very irregular, dependent on suitable conditions. Consequently, these birds don't breed every year, and breeding usually includes only one egg. The young grow relatively slowly and continue to increase in skeletal size and mass between fledging, and they continue to grow up to 3 or 4 years of age, which I found particularly impressive for how long that took. Drying up of the breeding lakes in South Africa sometimes forces young chicks to walk long distances to reach water, with large numbers dying on the way. So this is a bird that's very, very sensitive to habitat loss or to the change in the quality of the water in the lakes. So and they have found when they've tried to breed these birds in captivity that it's been very, very difficult, probably because the bird has such specialized eating habits. So now, because of that problem, conservation is focusing on ensuring that the breeding and feeding sites are redesignated as protected areas and maintained in the best environmental condition possible, and that when the colonies are breeding, that they're not disturbed. So this is not a bird that is going to respond to captive breeding efforts to restore the population. Okay. In Tarangire National Park, we saw elephants, zebras, as well as 3 species of endangered vultures. And I'm going to show you that in a minute. But in this picture, you can see the iconic baobab trees. And if you look closely, a troop of baboons that are running there on the savanna. So a group of vultures has different names depending on what they're doing. A group of vultures is typically known as a colt, C-O-L-T, not cult, colt committee or venue. And when flying, vultures are called a kettle. And when feeding, the group is called a wake. African vultures are very gregarious, sociable species, and they're often found in large numbers at kills, usually mixing with other vulture species, which is what we saw. The only natural predators for vultures are humans. African vultures lay about just 1 egg, and both parents tend the nest. The chicks stay with the parents for up to a year. They become sexually mature at about age 6. As many of you may know, the bald head of an African vulture aids in regulating its body temperature in the sub-Saharan climate, and also keeps the bird clean while it's feeding on carcasses, as the feathers, as normal feathers, would store germs more easily. Vultures sunbathe after meals, which allows the heat from the sun to dry any bacteria from the dead animal, preventing it from spreading. The sunbathing also helps rid their feathers of unwanted dangerous parasites. When they get out in the sun, the heat from the sun makes the parasites move around, and then it's a lot easier for the birds to remove them when they're preening. Okay. The African white-backed vultures cannot detect animals from smell alone. They also rely greatly on their eyesight, which is why they use their 7.5-foot wingspan to soar high in the sky. These are really big birds. But they often soar at great heights so they can look down and find their next meal. Even though it's not considered their primary way of finding their meals, they are thought to be able to smell a carcass from up to 4 miles away. There are currently about 10,000 of these white-backed vultures left, making it the most common of the vultures in Africa. The numbers are dropping rapidly, and it's considered critically endangered. The lappet-faced vulture, sometimes called the ear or Nubian vulture, stands about 3.5 feet tall and has a wingspan of up to 9.5 feet. This is the dominant vulture out there, and you can see the two vultures coming through. It makes me feel like Star Wars or something. They're coming through like they taking over, but the other vultures definitely moved out of their way. They were the dominant ones, and here's one of the vultures flying in over the rest of the vultures who are eating. All right. It is listed as endangered, here we go. Okay. Like many vulture species, the Ruppel's vulture is the king of long distance travel. It often covers great distances in search of food, and it's been known to spend as much as 7 hours or more in the sky without stopping. In 2004, the Ruppel's vulture was listed as a species of least concern. 18 years later, this African vulture is now critically endangered. And this is another picture of the Ruppel's vulture. It's flying in to join other vultures. I included this picture. I don't know how well it shows here, but on my computer, I can see it easily. We started our days before 6 in the morning. We were out so that as soon as the sun came up, we were ready to start our photography. But the temperatures rose very rapidly, and heat distortion was a problem virtually every single day on our trip. And if you look behind the vulture, you can see kind of that shimmer of heat distortion. It was just one of those challenges that we had as we were taking these pictures. In this picture, it shows all these 3 endangered species together. So we have 2 lappet-faced in the front, 3 white-backed in the middle, and 1 Ruppel's vulture in the back. So why are these numbers dropping so rapidly and so dramatically? And the biggest problem is that these birds are dying from poisoning. They're being poisoned because the farmers and others put out pesticides and poisons to protect their livestock, and they're trying to kill lions and hyenas that attack their livestock. They spread the poison on a dead cow, and then other animals eat that too, like the hyenas and the jackals, the tawny eagles, and the vultures. So all of the animals, there are animals in addition to the primary predators of lions and hyenas who are eating these poisoned animals, and they are dying from that. Another issue, which I found very interesting, is that poachers use poison, and they put the poison, if they've, for example, come in to take an elephant and taken the tusk of the elephant, they will then put poison in the elephant carcass, knowing that the vultures will come and eat the poison and die. And because the vultures are dying, they're not giving away the location of the carcass. And the poachers feel that that gives them the opportunity to get away without being investigated. So they're trying to cover up their crime, their first crime with the elephants, by poisoning the vultures and killing them. Vultures can also die from lead poisoning when they eat the bullets and such that are used by farmers to kill the animals. And some vultures are used for medicinal purposes. So they're captured for that. And once again, power lines are an issue when they're flying. They can get caught in power lines. So lots and lots of challenges. All right, this we were out looking for leopards and happened to spot this eagle up in a tree, and it was you can see it had caught a meal, and it was busy eating. The Martial eagle, which is pictured here, is the largest eagle of Africa and one of the world's most powerful avian predators. Due to its underside spotting and ferocious efficiency as a predator, it is sometimes nicknamed the leopard of the air. So we kind of caught our leopard that way. Martial eagles are also one of the strongest eagles. They're able to knock an adult man off his feet. And in this image, he's eating a vervet monkey. And I put in a picture of a vervet monkey just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea. The body of the vervet monkey is about the size of a well-developed 2-year-old child. The Martial eagles are found in most of sub-Saharan Africa. They like to live in the open woods. They lay one egg maybe every 2 years. So it is not, they don't have a frequent replenishing of their population, and the parents care for the chicks up to 12 months. And they don't become reach reproductive maturity until about 5 years of age. So this is an endangered population, but the actual size and numbers is unknown. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done to learn about what the status of these birds. The fact that they mature so slowly and have such a low reproductive rate are problems that are really going to be a challenge for their long-term survival. They are facing some of the same threats as some of the other birds: habitat loss. They're shot and poisoned by hunters to protect their livestock, things like that. So those are a variety of threats. There's also habitat destruction that takes down the trees they use for nesting sites. Okay, well, not all of the endangered birds that we've seen have been out of the United States. We've made 2 trips within the states where we've seen some endangered birds, one to Florida and one to Texas. All right. So the Florida scrub jay, really charming bird, is the only species that lives exclusively in Florida. And it likes to live in low-growing scrub oak and in sandy soils. It collects acorns during the fall and buries them throughout their territory to eat later in the year. It's a social bird. It forms extended family groups, and the young from previous years help the parents at subsequent nests until they can get a territory of their own. They're homebodies. These birds don't migrate, and they rarely move more than a few miles from where they've hatched. The flight of the scrub jay is generally short, direct, and it's not very elegant. So consequently, they're reluctant to fly very far. That's part of the problem. Although their primary diet is acorns, they also relish peanuts and sometimes can become habituated to humans. And as you can see, the birds we photographed were not at all camera shy. And that's my husband there with the bird on his head. It's estimated that there are about 4,000 of these jays remaining. They have a threatened status. And the biggest threats for them are that their habitat in which they live, which is quite specialized, is very fragmented now. So as you can imagine, these pictures were taken near Melbourne, Florida, Central Florida, lots of housing and other development in that area. And there's really no place for these birds to expand their territories. So they, part of what they're trying to do is create more protected land for these birds. And the birds we photographed were in the Crookshank preserve. Okay. So this is a little woodpecker called the Red-Cockaded Woodpecker. I unfortunately don't have a picture that shows the little red that has given it its name, but these are very specialized woodpeckers of the southeast of the United States. They were very abundant when there were big stands of longleaf pine, but those were harvested, and the habitat is no longer there. The bird was first listed as endangered in 1970. And this is a bird that they have been following and tracking pretty carefully. And if you look closely in the pictures, you can see the bands around the legs of the bird. So they've been really trying to get information about what they can do to help with the breeding and protection. Let's see. Conservation measures include creating artificial cavities, moving females from between groups so that they can create another breeding group, and managing habitat. So let's go back up. Okay. All right. Another thing that we wanted to photograph in Florida were snail kites. And in order to get to see the snail kites, we went out in an airboat, and this is the boat there, and they're designed so that they skim over the top of the water. You go right over the vegetation, and it means that you can get quite close to shore, and you can get to places and see the birds in a way that you couldn't possibly see from the land. The snail kite, we went on 2 different lakes in Central Florida, again near Orlando, and these are freshwater habitat. So here are the snail kites here. Snail kites forage generally by flying slowly over marshy areas and open water. And then they hover and they watch, and then they drop down to grab a snail out of the shallow water. They need water that's really clear so that they can see the snails on the bottom. And you can, on the lower picture, this is a kite that has just gotten a snail. The males generally select the nest site, which can be in trees near shallow water, or they can build nests in vegetation such as sawgrass. And in the upper left, this is a picture of a male kite who is defending the nest, which is buried deeper into that sawgrass. Again, if you look carefully, you can see that these birds are also banded, and they're being very carefully studied. The snail kite is a very unusual bird because it survives almost exclusively on the apple snail. And if you look at the bill, it is slender, it's deeply hooked, and it's curved, and it adapted for extracting the snail from its shell. Until recently, Florida population of snail kites fed almost exclusively on Florida apple snails, which can only live under specific wetland conditions. But an invasive snail from South America, which can survive in a much wider range of habitat, including man-made wetlands, has invaded Florida. This snail, this bigger apple snail, is 2 to 5 times the size of the native snail. And conservationists were worried that the kites would not be able to get the meat, to get the actual snail out of the shell, and would be starving because they wouldn't get enough to eat. But what they found out, which is so interesting, was that where the new snails spread, the kites followed them. And more remarkably, studies of the kite indicated that the beaks of the kites began to evolve over a short period of time, becoming longer and more effective in managing the bigger snails. So ironically, while this bird was threatened, the arrival of this invasive snail has actually helped these birds increase in numbers over the last number of years. This snail kite is widely distributed in Central and South America. They're very common there. I've photographed them in other places, but in the United States, they're federally endangered. They were brought to the brink of extinction when the US started draining the Everglades before it created the national park. The despite the help of the snails, the population of snail kites is still at risk from chemical pollutants. There are a lot of issues from the chemicals from industry and agriculture getting into these wetlands. But overall, this population seems to be improving, doing better. The latest count in the US is that there are about 1,700 of these snail kites. Okay. In South Texas, we were hoping to see the highly endangered whooping crane, and I feel like we were very successful. I felt so lucky to see this bird. By going out early by boat, we saw the birds eating their blue crabs, which is their preferred food. That was out in the barrier islands off the south coast of Texas. And on land, we photographed the birds from blind as they flew in to look for insect seeds and berries. The whooping cranes are really very big. It weighs 15 pounds. It has a wingspan more than 7 feet, and it's as tall as many humans. The whooping cranes mate for life and generally raise, when things are going well, raise 1 chick per year. The pair returns to the same area each spring and chases other cranes from their nesting area. They're territorial. Until this year, the oldest known whooping crane was 29 years old. But this past winter, in 2022, researchers in Texas recaptured a female crane, which was first banded in 1980, making her at least 42 years old. And what was even more heartening and special was that she was still migrating annually and was with a mate and a chick, or colt, they called them, that the pair was raising successfully. So that was a pretty cool thing to learn when we made our trip. In 1941, there were only 21 whooping cranes left. 15 were migrants between Canada and Texas, while the rest lived year-round in Louisiana. The Louisiana population went extinct, and all 800 of today's whooping cranes, about 650 which live in the wild, about 150 in captivity, are descended from that very small flock that breeds in Texas. The primary factors leading to endangered status of the cranes are habitat loss and past rampant unregulated hunting of the birds. Today, the only self-sustaining population of whooping cranes is the naturally occurring flock of 500 birds that breeds in Canada. And you can look at the map here. I'm showing you the migration route. Breeds in Canada and winters along the Gulf Coast of Texas. They begin their fall migration to Texas in mid-September and begin the spring migration north to Canada in late March or early April. So they travel more than 2,400 miles a year. The Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, where I took these pictures, was created to protect the cranes wintering along the Texas coast, and it seems to be working. Let's see. One of the things you may have heard about was a very unusual attempt, creative conservation attempt to reintroduce captive bred birds into existing populations. For a number of years, researchers led by Kent Clegg taught captive reared whooping cranes to fly and follow a small ultralight aircraft. Craig led them in an 800-mile migration from Wisconsin breeding grounds and Florida between Wisconsin and the Florida wintering grounds. He did this for a number of years, but the experiment was halted in 2015 because the adult birds did not have parenting skills and did not produce ample number of chicks to establish another flock. Unfortunately, many of the reintroduction efforts over the past decades have not been successful. But thankfully, the Texas population continues to grow. And it was very cool to see parents with their colts and a couple of cases where they had 2 of the chicks. The Reddish Egret was another bird that we saw in South Texas. They live in salt flats and lagoons around barrier islands. They often build nests in rookeries with other birds such as pelicans, spoonbills, and great blue herons. And that's in fact what we saw when we went out to the islands in this Aransas Wildlife Refuge. These reddish egrets were among various other egrets, and herons, great blue herons, pelicans, all were right there. And these birds were flying in and out and really showing off that gorgeous breeding plumage. Let's see. The history on these birds is that in the 19th century, the population was decimated for the feather trade, the plume trade. And after they, a law was passed called the Lacey Act, which prohibited the feather trade. And that helped the bird population recover and stabilize. The feathers are amazing, but it's just so disheartening to think that this bird was almost brought to extinction so that people could have feathers for their hats. This bird remains the rarest heron in North America, and the biggest portion of their population is in Texas. It's estimated there are about 15,000 of these birds left, and they're at risk from climate change because climate change brings with it more frequent and stronger storms, tropical storms, which destroy these barrier islands. So when these islands, which they use for nesting, are overrun, then they are lacking places for feeding and nesting. So. We had a trip that we made to Bolivia in 2019, and it was organized specifically for photographing parrots in the wild. And we had two particular macaws that we were really trying to see, and that was the blue-throated macaw and the red-fronted macaw. For the past 7 years or so, my husband and I have been supporting conservation efforts targeting these two species. So this trip not only gave us a chance to photograph the birds, but to see where the birds lived, to go to these remote areas in Bolivia, see the habitat, and to meet the conservationists who are doing the work out in the field. Okay, the red-fronted macaw is endemic to Bolivia. It's listed as critically endangered. It can only be found in dry Andean valleys of central Bolivia, where it roosts and nests in cliffs. And there are two major nesting areas, one in south central Bolivia in Armonia, and one farther west in Jardín de Cacta. I was practicing this, Cactaquesas. I know I didn't get it right. We were in Armonia, which is pictured here at the very end of the dry season. So there you can see a little bit of flowing water, but most of the riverbed was dry, and we could walk up and down that riverbed looking for, hoping to spot the macaws. But even when you did spot a macaw, it was often up high on the cliff and very difficult to photograph. So I have a few images from that area, but these were particularly hard to photograph. And heat distortion was another real challenge when we were photographing these birds. In the western area where the birds are nesting and roosting, we were able to actually climb up on the cliffs and look across and down at the birds as they roosted. So they were still very, very far away, however, making the photography again very challenging. You can see, try and kind of get perspective on that by just how small the birds were in the frame. In this picture, I have shown you, I'm showing you two of the people who are very important on a local level for the macaw conservation. One on the left in the darker blue shirt is someone from a NGO in Bolivia that specializes in parrot conservation, and his specialty was working with local farmers. He grew up in this area, and working with them to educate them about the needs of the macaws and to get them on board to help with conservation. The man on the right is a local farmer, and he is someone who is now on board to conserve the macaws. But he admitted that for years he would shoot the macaws because they would come in and they would eat his crops. And now he is saying that he does understand that they are critically endangered, and he's agreed to begin to plant some other types of trees and that around the property that can provide food for the macaws, but hopefully keep them out of the farm area. This is his farm right behind there. So the being targeted by farmers was a big threat for this bird, and these birds were also trafficked for the pet trade, illegal pet trade. So it was very interesting to see and see this area where the birds come in, and then to meet this farmer and his wife and hear their side of the story and what it's like for them. There's a bird that is quite well known, and perhaps certain more often known than the two other macaws that I've talked about, and that's the blue and gold macaw. And I'm going to tell you about that. We saw many of these as we travel around Bolivia, and in northeastern Bolivia, I was able to watch for about a half hour as this pair that you see went through their courtship behaviors. They just sat on the top of the stump, and they preened each other, and they danced, and they did all kinds of displays. It was just very cool. I had a chance to talk with this local farmer, and he told me that this pair had been returning successfully to that stump for maybe 5 years and had raised about a dozen chicks successfully. He took great pride in the fact that this was local success, and kind of felt ownership. So here, these birds are breeding right near the pastures in the town. So while the blue and gold macaw is listed as least concern by the Iucn, because it is still fairly common in parts of its range, it has already become extinct in Panama, Trinidad, Guyana, and Southeast Brazil. The biggest threat to these birds is trapping for the pet trade. And this continues despite the fact that all of that has been banned since the 1980s. Thankfully, when the birds are undisturbed, as they were in this remote area of Bolivia, and they can find suitable habitat like this stump of an old palm tree for nesting, they have been quite successful in building back their populations. So more work needs to be done on the pet trade. The blue-throated macaws look very similar to the blue and gold macaws. If you look there, they have a lot of similarity. But the blue-throated macaws are critically endangered. In fact, they were thought to be extinct until 1992, when a small wild population was found in Bolivia. It's estimated there are about 250 of these macaws in the wild. So it was truly a privilege to be able to see any in the wild, and to see them in their habitat. This is what their habitat looks like. There are, we were there during the dry seasons. There was flat land that was dry. They put a lot of cattle out there now. And then there are, on that flat land are these islands, which they think were built up by ancient populations, raised up as places for planting and living. The blue-throated macaws like to live in these and nest in these groves of palms. And so this kind of these little islands, which can be separated, really substantially separated, are very, very important for them as a safe place to live and breed. Because this bird is so critically endangered, they're undertaking a lot of conservation efforts, multi-pronged efforts. One is that they've found farmers who are willing to hang artificial nest boxes on their property. Perhaps the farmers have spotted the macaws in the area. They have appropriate trees and such. And so you can see here, this is someone who's putting up one of these artificial nest boxes. So that's one approach. Another approach is that there has been some effort to do some rescue of birds that were caught for the pet trade. They're working on some plans to bring macaws from Canada and the US back to Bolivia and reintroduce them and start captive breeding and release. And that's another effort there. And then another, perhaps the strongest effort overall, is to create protected areas where the bird's habitat is protected. And this is really good because it protects not only the habitat for the blue-throated macaws, but for other species in Bolivia, which are also threatened or endangered. And here's an example. Sometimes when you look for endangered birds, you also find endangered mammals. And this giant anteater carrying the baby on its back was wandering through one of those palm islands that I showed you. And we just happened to spot it as it was walking by. It was just super, super cool to see that. Unfortunately, these animals are also vulnerable and at risk for extinction. Costa Rica. I've made 6 trips to Costa Rica over the past years, and it remains one of my favorite places to visit, despite the fact that doing photography there is always a challenge. It somehow always involves long drives on rutted dirt roads. It seems like there's always dense vegetation and it's raining. It's dark, it's challenging, the birds can be far away, and it's still a very magical place for me. I've been in Costa Rica several times with Steve Perry, and he called photography in Costa Rica black belt photography. So I kind of feel like that's a cool description of the challenges that you can face when you're doing birds there. One of the birds that we saw in Costa Rica that is quite cool is the 3-wattled bellbird, and it's quite a secretive bird, and it lives up in the canopy of tall trees in mountainous forests in Central America. It only lives in Central America. And during breeding season, the adult males spend most of the day calling in their territories. The call is a sharp metallic bell sound followed by this strange boink. The call is made by the bird after the bird body is positioned forward and the mouth is open. And if you look in the picture on the right, you can see that bird has its mouth wide open and it's leaning forward. The bird's call produces a sound of 100 decibels, which is actually loud enough to damage human eardrums. And it can be heard remarkably long distances. The songs of the 3-wattled bellbird are learned and they're regionally specific. So the adults continue to learn new songs as they go within their territory. Now I have this picture here just to kind of give you a sense of 2 different things. One is that we were going to photograph these birds, and if you look across the valley, way over, that's where the birds were. And we could hear them so clearly because their call was so loud. We could hear them, couldn't see them. They were way over there, but we could hear them. So that's one thing I wanted to point out. The other thing I wanted to point out is that this shows how this habitat has been cleared, and that the natural trees and forests that they rely on, that high canopy, has been cleared out of this area in Costa Rica. And that is true in Panama and in Nicaragua, where all the vegetation that they need in the non-breeding season has been cleared out. So they have really no place to go in those countries during the non-breeding season. So that just can give you a sense of that. There's very limited data about this bird. because it is a very secretive lifestyle. Other than the males during the mating season, making that call. Once that's done, they are very hard to find. They live very high up in the canopy. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to learn more about what the birds need and how we can protect them. So Resplendent Quetzals, members of the Trogon family, live in the mountainous tropical forests of Central America. They eat little avocados, not the big ones that we know and love. I love. But if you look carefully on the picture on the right, they're little, more the size of walnuts, and they love those. Fruits, insects, lizards, and other creatures. During the mating season, male Resplendent Quetzals grow elongated upper tail coverts. And you can see that really well illustrated in the left. The train of the feather can be up to 3 feet long. And they play a big part, these feathers play a big part in the display of the Quetzals when they're flying. And the picture on the right gives you a sense of that fluid look that they have when they fly from one place to the next. Birds nest in making holes in rotted trees, and in both cases, these male birds are at nest holes. The one on the left is just starting that nesting behavior, and the one on the right is bringing in food to a chick that's in the nest. It's hard to believe, but the males do fit themselves and their tail into that nest cavity, and it just comes back out up over their head, which is also cool to see. Unfortunately, I don't have a good picture to show you of that. All right. So one of the challenges of photographing this bird is that they live in the rainforest. And so they're often either in heavily shaded areas or where it's raining hard. And you can see in both of these pictures, it was raining the entire time we were out trying to get photos. But thankfully, because these birds are part of the Trogon family, they sit patiently. And so you can drop your shutter speed way, way, way down. And if you're lucky, you can get some good pictures. So although these birds have been considered have been honored and treasured since pre-Columbian times by the peoples of Latin America, South America, and the Mayan and Aztec cultures, they are now endangered birds. And the biggest reason for that is habitat loss, once again, and habitat fragmentation and clearing for agricultural use. In Costa Rica, there have been, with ecotourism, they are able to get more and more people locally to protect trees, protect areas, and then they earn money as you come to photograph on their property. So you can come and set up your tripod or whatever and photograph there, and then they earn money from that. So that's a way that encourages locals to be more engaged in protecting the birds. All right, the great curassow. It's a large pheasant-like bird. It also lives in the rainforests. It's about the size of a turkey, likes to go around in groups like turkeys do. Mostly it forages on the ground, but it's willing to roost in trees. It's listed as vulnerable, habitat loss for logging and overhunting. They're trying to captive breeding program in Ecuador to see if they could reintroduce the birds. I just think these birds are lots of fun. They just have quite the personality, quite distinctive. Okay. So this is the great green macaw. There have been a number of macaws that are critically endangered. Sadly, parrots as a species are the most endangered of all. The great green macaw is a distribution in humid lowlands and foothills from Honduras to northwestern Colombia. And small numbers have been seen in Ecuador, but there's not a very significant population. These birds, like most other macaws, are highly sociable. They often are in family groups of 5 to 6 birds, and they nest in tree cavities. Outside of the breeding season, they forage and roost in groups of up to 50. these birds are particularly associated with a particular tree, the mountain almond or almendro tree, which provides both food and nest sites for the bird across much of its range. Unfortunately, with logging and conversion of land for agriculture, which in Costa Rica means land for pineapple and cattle pastures, the habitat for the great green macaws has been greatly diminished. And in fact, the almendro tree is also an endangered species. Sometimes, unfortunately, farmers also shoot the birds, believing they are crop pests, and they are captured for the pet trade and for their feathers. They're listed as critically endangered. They think there are about 1,000 of these birds left in the wild. And they are just such magnificent parrots to see. It's amazing how beautiful they are. Okay. And then we come to the Scarlet Macaw. Globally, the Scarlet Macaw is listed as a species of least concern because there's still significant populations in South America. However, in Central America, where the bird was once very common, the Scarlet Macaw population has dropped precipitously because of habitat loss and capture for the pet trade. Scarlets are extinct or on the brink of extinction in Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. Relic populations of these macaws exist in Costa Rica in the Curacao Park, and it's estimated that although they were once very common in Central America, at this point, there are only about 1,000 Scarlet Macaws left in Central America. The Macaw Recovery Network is another organization with which we've worked extensively for many years now. And they have developed a captive breeding program for release of these Scarlet Macaws in the northwest corner of Costa Rica. And this is used to be a part of the bird's range, and they're trying to reintroduce them into that part of Costa Rica. So we have been very intimately involved with that group and gotten to know them very well. They're also making efforts, because they work with both the great green macaw and the Scarlet Macaw, to engage local communities as rangers to help with bird counts, to help educate school children. They have developed programs for replanting of the almendro tree and other trees that are important for the birds. They are purchasing land to protect land, and they do training for conservationists and have a captive breeding site up in the northwest corner. So they are taking a multi-pronged approach, trying different things to see what works best, and recognizing that this is a complex problem and needs lots of different approaches. This last picture I threw in just for fun. One of the things that I've just been trying lately is playing with Topaz Studio 2. And this is my attempt to have some fun with a photograph I took of a Scarlet Macaw. So there we are. I hope it didn't go too fast or too slow. Let me know if you have any questions. You can either write them in the chat. I see there's some in the chat already, and then, or you can just call them out, whatever feels right for you.